And now it's my very great honor to introduce today's presenters. Ken Dykewald, who is our moderator, is the president and CEO of AgeWave and a member of the ASA board. Meryl Comer is CEO and president of the Jeffrey Bean Foundation's Alzheimer's Initiative, and she joins our panel this afternoon as both a national expert and a caregiver. Her story is one that many in this room will resonate with. Dr. Stanley Prusiner is the esteemed Nobel laureate and recipient of the 2010 Presidential Medal of Science. He is the director of the Institute for Neurodegenerative Diseases at the University of California, San Francisco. And finally, Harry Johns is the president and CEO of the Alzheimer's Association, an organization that has been working for decades in search of a cure. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
I'm honored to be a part of this panel and to be here at this moment, which hopefully we'll all remember 10 years from now, as we raise our glass of wine and celebrate the end of Alzheimer's. I believe we come here together today to consider changing the course of history. This extraordinary Shakespearean fable of a movement towards long-lived people has some flaws in it. And perhaps the most consequential flaw is that we've created long-lived men and women whose brains become rotted, whose brains become demented, who can't take care of themselves anymore. It's a horrible disease, a horrific disease. And what I'd like to do with you is to share with you how this looks to me and what the forces are at play and why I and many of you, and hopefully all of us by the time we're done with this hour session or so, we'll commit ourselves and all the contacts we have and the ability we have to prioritize and shape policy to move towards the direction of ending this disease. There are three forces that I see converging simultaneously. First, we are in the midst of a longevity revolution. Humans have always been searching for fountains of youth, remarkable mountaintops where perhaps you might be spared the misfortune of dying young. But it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century when folks like these, public health workers, began to actually impact the number of years that people lived. And then, of course, the 1920s. In addition to the ability to manage and distribute food more effectively, we saw the emergence of antibiotics. And many of the diseases that would have taken our parents and grandparents down could now be treated with a shot of penicillin. And without saying anything, how many of you know exactly what this is a picture of? If you could raise your hands, please. Most young people today wouldn't know what this picture is at all. These are iron lungs. Back in the 1940s when poliomyelitis was rampant and uncertain, and nobody knew quite how you caught it and what you could possibly do to be rid of it, we only could treat it by putting people in these chambers that breathed for them. I was lucky as a young man in my late 20s, I could collaborate on a book with Jonas Salk. And Jonas told me a story one night at dinner about how in the 40s everybody was talking about how we needed to be more sensitive to folks with this horrible disease of polio and why we would need more and more and more and more and more iron lungs. Yet Jonas's point of view was quite the opposite. He felt we must do away with polio. We must end polio, not more iron lungs. He had his breakthrough in 53. He and Sabin distributed the product in 55. And now today, this is an ancient picture. Here's John Feather getting his polio shot as a young boy. And of course, the 20th century was filled with modern miracles, which for the first time in history gave us more and more and more old people. And that's kind of how it works. It's a little bit like a sausage machine. Every time you have a breakthrough in management of disease or a new pharmacologic product or people take better care of themselves, what comes out the other end is more old people. It's just the way it works. 2/3 of all the men and women who have ever lived past 65 in the entire history of the world are alive today. So I know this is ironic sounding, but it turns out that the most new thing on the planet today is old people. We always had 40 and 60 and 80-year-olds, but not very many. Take a look with me at this chart. It's a chart of the average life expectancy at birth over the past 1,000 years. And what you have to be struck by, as I am, is that on the first day of the 20th century, the average life expectation at birth was a mere 47. By the end of that century, it had vaulted to 78. That's a bigger lift in one century than in the previous 900 years combined. And the point is simple, but perhaps profound. And that is that throughout all of history, most people didn't age, they died. So in the 1850s, couples didn't worry about what they were going to do in their retirement years because they'd be dead. Our medical system didn't need to be expert at things like hypercholesterolemia, osteoarthritis, adult onset diabetes, or Alzheimer's, because people were inclined to die young of acute infectious diseases, accidents, trauma, childbirth, before they got old enough to have these other kinds of conditions. I'm going to click this device in my hand and show you what the average life expectancy was at birth over the past 100,000 years. And here the story becomes even more extraordinary. Medical anthropologists now tell us that throughout 99% of all the years that humans have walked this earth, the average life expectancy at birth was under 18. And so it's only been in the last several hundred years that we have begun to have these breakthroughs that have been giving us the dream of history, the chance to live 50 years, 70 years, perhaps 90 years, to go back to school at 50, to know our grandchildren, to meet our great-grandchildren, to have deep thoughts, to have a chance to form a perspective, to travel the world, to help others, to reinvent yourself. The dream of history is happening now. And I would argue that this longevity revolution at the end of the day will have a bigger impact on who we are and how we feel and how we relate within our families and how long we work and the economy of nations and the competitiveness of nations than either the industrial or technological revolutions of previous centuries. This one has never happened before, and it changes everything. The second theme to add into this bit of a Shakespearean drama is that in addition to the idea that more and more of us now are living longer and longer and longer, is that we had a sort of a demographic fluke, a perturbation after World War II. The boys came home, and during the years of the Depression and the war, the birth rate in America hit an all-time low. But then when the boys came home, there was this great feeling of hopefulness, and we entered a period of prosperity, and GI loans were readily available, and America was booming in terms of its technology and its marketplace and its hopefulness. And 76 million kids were born during that next 18-year period. 1 every 8 seconds, about 10,000 a day on average, 4 million a year, followed by a baby bust. Now look with me at these next charts, which I'm going to glance through sort of swiftly. This is, in a sense, a demographic map of the 1950s. What it reveals is each demographic segment, from youth to middle age to maturity, and it shows you during that decade which group grew or shrunk relative to itself. And what we can see, and of course we already knew this, the 1950s was a period of enormous upsurgence of youth because of all these kids being born. And it put enormous pressure on the medical system. And in fact, pediatric medicine emerged fresh and new during that period of time. It put enormous pressure on homes because the homes had been built smaller for smaller families. As those of you can remember, it put enormous pressure on our schools. It put enormous pressure on teachers. We didn't have enough pillows. We didn't have enough shoes. We didn't have enough playgrounds. And America swelled under this baby boom. But then the next decade, the growth was no longer among small children. The growth was among teenagers. And then with every decade that's passed, this baby boom is turning into an age wave. This was the year 1990 to year 2000. It would have been a great time to have been President of the United States. Why? Because the number of 18 to 34-year-olds shrank by 9 million people. You could have taken credit for the low unemployment. The boomers were entering into their peak tax-paying years, and the elder generation, having been born during the Depression, were a small cohort, and so you could lavish enormous benefits on them without breaking the bank. That decade ended. This was the decade we just came out of. And what you see is that the groups under the age of 45 are shrinking in America, and the groups over 45 are growing. I'm now going to show you how America is reconfiguring between 2000 and 2020. Watch this. This is totally predictable. This age wave is the most predictable demographic force there is. And so what will become of us as more and more of us live longer and longer? What will be the new business opportunities as we have 60 and 70 and 80 and 90-year-olds by the tens of millions? But what will become of the institutions designed to serve older people? Will there be enough funding? Will there be enough of them? And do we have the right solutions in place? Just as there was a baby boom that began in the beginning of 1946, in January of this year, every 8 seconds on average, 10,000 a day, 4 million a year. The boomers have begun to turn 65, and they're on their way to elderhood. And the question, of course, is that going to be a wonderful thing, a triumph, or is that going to be fraught with disaster, a tragedy? Which takes me to my third theme. I've mentioned this before. There's this fantastic fable of the beautiful goddess Eos, who fell in love with a mortal warrior, who, of course, being a mortal man, was destined to die. So Eos asked Zeus to grant him immortality. Please allow him to live forever. And Zeus said, your wish is granted. And as the fable goes, Tithonus got older and sicker, and older and sicker, and his bones broke, and his organs rotted, and his brain became demented, but he could never die. And strangely, in some ways, that is the version of longevity that we have constructed during this past century. Longer life, but not necessarily longer health. So there are lots of problems that happen as we age. Just to give you a bit of a glance at those, and don't take this too personally, it'll ruin the rest of your afternoon and evening. There are changes. We have circulatory problems in greater numbers, a greater likelihood of arthritis in the joints, varicosity in our veins, our metabolism shifts. We're more likely to have orthopedic impairments, and I could really kind of ruin your whole day here. So then the question becomes, for those of us in the field, well, which are the big ones? Which are the small ones? Which are the ones we can manage with lifestyle? Which is the ones that can be managed with the current pharmacopoeia available? Which are the ones that we have to be frightened of, and which are the ones that are more trivial? And I have to tell you, this is what takes me to this session. This is why we decided to pull it together. I've now spent 37 years in the field, and my point of view perhaps is not right all the time, but from where I sit, Alzheimer's is the single greatest challenge facing the aging of our nation there is. It is number one. Why do I say, thank you. Why do I say this? People say, well, isn't it poverty? Isn't it housing? Isn't it employment? Isn't it ageism? Yeah, I can see all of those. But this one just rises up. And here's why. Because the dementia rate over the age of 85 is 1 in 2. 1 in 2. 1 in 2. And so here's the cruel irony, that because of breakthroughs in medicine and antibiotics and nutrition and management of refrigeration and self-care, more and more of us are going to live to be 80 and 90 or 100. But unless we, and I really want to say we, unless we can bring an end to this disease, there will be tens of millions of us taken down with dementia. Every one of our families. And while we can talk about the nourishment needed to be given to the caregivers and the sympathy we feel for those who suffer, my mom has now got Alzheimer's. And so many of you have family members with this condition. We all are touched by it. 47% is a staggering statistic. And I want to say something, and I want you to take this personally. I'm not talking for this moment about them. I'm talking about you. You will have Alzheimer's. You or your loved one will have Alzheimer's. Your family will buckle under this because we'll do better at things like diabetes, cardiovascular, respiratory, and so we will live longer and longer and longer with this horrible disease. Unless we somehow raise the courage, the funds, and the scientific brainpower to end it. And I'm terribly concerned about the fact that the 85-plus segment of our population is the fastest growing. What does this look like to me? When I saw the radar pictures and the pictures from the sky before Katrina rolled into the Gulf, I thought, this is amazing. You can see this storm coming. It was clear as a bell. You can see its trajectory. You knew how fast it was moving, and yet we did almost nothing to prepare, and the aftercare was slow in coming, and it was a disaster. What does Alzheimer's look like to me? I thought, maybe twice Katrina. No. It's 5 times Katrina. This is what is coming our way. This is where we're heading, to a future that will be buckled by this disease. And as John Feather mentioned, currently it is 100% incurable, 100% fatal. What about the cost of this disease? Well, if you begin to add it up, if we have no breakthrough between now and the year 2050, the cumulative cost, more people living longer with the condition, $20 trillion. And let me also remind you that for every dollar we spend on caring for people with this condition, we spend 1/3 of a penny on cure. Every dollar we spend on care, 1/3 of a penny on cure. Alzheimer's will not be beaten in the senior center. It won't be beaten at the gym. It won't be beaten with health foods. It won't be beaten by doing crossword puzzles. It'll be beaten because we in the field who touch it, who smell it, who see it, who feel it, who are frightened by it, will cause our political leaders and our scientific community to rise up and put the attention, resources, and talent needed to wipe this disease out. And I would say to you as I conclude my comments, tag, you're it. When it all began to be more clear to me over these last several years just how serious a challenge we had, and also the possibility that with sufficient funding and courage and will and political forethought, we could wipe it out, I then thought to myself, how can I not throw myself in front of this issue and try to bring an end to it? So tag, you're it. This is not about how do we build more iron lungs. This is about how do we wipe this disease out.